It is, I think it's Wednesday, April 22nd, and this is our history lesson for the day. When we concluded yesterday, we were discussing the status of the Allies. Early December of 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and that brought the United States into the war. At that particular moment, the Axis powers were probably at the peak of their expansion. Germany was certainly at the height of its power. Japan, over the course of the next couple of months, would hit their apex, if you want to say it that way. But we're going to see exactly what develops in the months ahead as we kind of enter into the year 1942. Japan was convinced when they struck America, they were convinced that America did not have the stomach for a real war. Most Japanese high command believed that if they were able to hit the Americans hard enough and quick enough, and really to bring America into the war. Remember, in World War I, at no time was any American territory actually attacked. The entire fight happened on really European soil. It was in other nations. And America had not actually experienced war on its own soil since 1861 through 1865, the American Civil War. And take away for that, you have to go back to 1812, the War of 1812, and then beyond that, the Revolutionary War. America had very little experience of fighting on its own home turf, if you want to put it that way. Many other nations had time and time again experienced the challenge of trying to defend their homeland. The Japanese high command were convinced that if America could be struck quickly and hard, that rather than fight, the American people would sue for peace. They would recognize the Japanese as, in some sense, equal and grant them the authority over all of South and East Asia. The Japanese high command did not understand America. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo had essentially created a military dictatorship in conjunction with Emperor Hirohito. He believed that America would back down in the face of real force. So over the course of the next several months, the Japanese conquered most of America and Britain's East Asian territories. This included places like Singapore and the Philippines, and a number of those other possessions. The Japanese sweep through the Pacific was devastating the Allied forces. In the early days of late 1941, early 1942, there was almost no good news for the Allies to cling to when it came to the Pacific theater. They were destroyed in every battle that they faced. A number of new British battleships, which were in the Pacific to guard British possessions, brand new ships, were sunk by carrier-based aircraft. It was obvious at this point that the new apex predator of the seas was no longer the battleship, it was the aircraft carrier. That had been a major change. In World War I, the aircraft carrier was basically non-existent. There was some seaplane tenders and a few other small ships, but for the most part, for the entire part, the battleship was the king. And in the 1930s and into the 40s, there was a transition, and no one really appreciated the strength and the power of that transition. But by 1941, it was obvious that aircraft carriers ruled the seas. So what happens is in 1942, the Japanese used their carrier fleet, supported by battleships, but their carrier fleet, their navy, to range all over the Pacific and to conquer as many of these territories as they can. And this included the Philippines. The Philippines were being defended by the Americans, who were led by General Douglas MacArthur. He had done poorly in his preparations, and so when the time came, the American troops were overwhelmed. A number of them were marched off to camps. Many of them died along the way. The Japanese treated prisoners of war abominably. We're going to see later on there should have been a greater accounting for what happened. But the Japanese established what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. That was a fancy way of describing what was really the Japanese Empire. The Japanese Empire started in Japan, reached out to China, into Korea, into the islands in the south. It really started butting up against Australia. It was the places, because remember, Japan, from a resource perspective, is rather poor. It doesn't have much of its own oil, its own iron, its own material necessary for making weapons. And so it was necessary for Japan to conquer these places because they needed a steady supply of rubber, of oil, of metals into the homeland so they could continue the fight. In early 1942, really the Japanese were at their peak. During this time, the leaders of the Allies gathered. So the leaders of the Allies at this point is President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States, Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Great Britain, and premier slash dictator, I can't remember his exact title, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. And they came to a conclusion. They would adopt what was called the Europe First strategy. The primary goal of the Allies was to eliminate the Nazi threat, the Germans, and then they would turn their attention to the Japanese. Now, this doesn't mean that they would do nothing in the Pacific. They just meant that when the time came to prioritize resources, Europe would be given the priority. Now, at this point, Britain and America, and when I say Britain, that includes all of the Commonwealth. So that's shorthand to include the Australians, the Canadians, New Zealanders, the Indians, the South Africans. They all fought bravely, nobly, and in the Pacific especially. They just took such a prime role. But I'm just including all of them under Britain. So Britain and America were fighting Japan. Soviet Union actually doesn't declare war on Japan until the very final days of the war. They just wanted to take some territory because, remember, through it all, the Soviet Union is utterly corrupt, utterly evil, and the Soviet Union and the communists were just as guilty of starting World War II as were the Nazis in Germany. But the Allies would operate under an Europe First strategy. Priority would be given to defeating Germany and Japan as they could. The Allies decided they needed to really open up a front. During this time, Stalin was screaming. He was demanding that the rest of the Allies attack Germany because at the moment, all the German attention was on his border, and he was taking the full brunt of the German attack. And so the Allies were, by 42, they were not able to land in Europe. Hitler had been reinforcing the shores and had turned Europe to what was called Fortress Europa. But they did begin thinking of other ways that they could strike at the Germans and distract some of the attention from the Soviet Union. So they began taking the fight to the Axis in 1942. This meant for 42 that they needed to focus on North Africa. Remember a little bit of the story of North Africa. The Italians had wanted to restart the Roman Empire, and they had invaded Ethiopia, but that had brought them into contact with the British. The Italians were overwhelmed by the British. In order to save their allies, the Germans sent down a pretty significant force called the Afrika Korps down into Africa to fight the British. It was so the North African theater becomes a new theater of World War II. They were led by General Erwin Rommel, one of the truly creative and great military minds of the 20th century and, frankly, of all time. He recognized how tank warfare should be done and how it should be integrated with infantry and artillery and air support when possible. He was a clever tactician and a good strategist. He understood the individual details as well as the big picture. Rommel in North Africa had faced a series of British generals, and he had beaten them all. His successes, though, were always limited because he had limited supplies. The British, who still controlled the seas for the most part, could resupply their men as frequently as they needed. The Germans, however, were much more limited. And so it was very possible, in fact happened, where Rommel could win a great victory, and as he was chasing the enemy, he would really literally be on the edge of running out of fuel. So he'd have to pull back and regroup, and he couldn't necessarily pursue his victory as hard as he would like. Because remember, we first met Rommel in the Battle of France, where he had broken rules, he had disobeyed orders, and he had pursued the French so hardly, or so diligently, that they were unable to set up an effective line of defense. So Rommel had proven himself to be an effective commander one time and time again. He just had limited supplies, and in light of all that was happening in the rest of the world and of the strategic limitations of what North Africa was, it was unlikely that the Axis powers, Germany, was going to give him everything he needed. In late 1942, the Allies launched Operation Torch, which was an important success. So Operation Torch, this combined operation of the British, but also the Americans. Operation Torch is one of the first big military expenditures and endeavors of the United States. It was the first World War II combat experience for Generals Dwight Eisenhower, General George Patton, and General Omar Bradley. Those are names you need to know. General Dwight Eisenhower is going to become the supreme commander of Allied forces. He's going to become a 5-star general. Eventually, Dwight Eisenhower will be responsible for all of the fighting. all American, all British, all French, all everything in the European theater. He is the most important soldier on the continent in Europe. Now you're going to find also George Patton. George Patton, in many ways, is probably the most famous of the soldiers. George Patton is the American version of Erwin Rommel, and to be honest, he's not as good as Rommel. Patton understands what tanks can do. He's a supremely aggressive commander. He is, as we've talked about earlier, a great man, but not a good man. He is great in that he is significant and important, but good. He has some serious moral and personal flaws. But Patton is an aggressive commander who is able to lead his troops to victory time and time again. And then General Omar Bradley. General Omar Bradley is the soldier's general. He's a wise man, a skilled tactician, not as aggressive as Patton, and sometimes that can lead to missed opportunities, but a very good general nonetheless, and one of the greatest that America ever had. So Patton was given command of a defeated and demoralized American corps. When we get to Operation Torch, it's the North African theater. Patton takes over for a failed American general. And when he arrives, he discovers that his men are defeatist. They feel that they have no chance of winning, that the Germans are overwhelming. Under his hard leadership, and I emphasize hard, he had to whip his troops into shape, and sometimes that included some things that were less than right, but he beat them into shape, and they became a force, a fighting force. They became a model of what an American army can and did look like. This right here is General Patton. At the time, he's a 3-star general. He was one who would travel with his troops. He was not afraid or unaccustomed to being on a tank. His men appreciated him for it, and he pushed them hard, and he pushed them to victory. So Operation Torch was a success. Rommel was defeated. He was not in any way defeated permanently, but he was forced to push back or to fall back. By 1943, the British general Bernard Montgomery led the Allies in the Tunisian campaign. Montgomery is probably the most well-known and the greatest of the British generals, and I'm going to be honest, I think he is extremely overrated. He makes some crucial mistakes later on in the war, and there are times where it's hard to tell if Montgomery is fighting for victory or fighting for personal glory. But Montgomery leads the Allies in the Tunisian campaign. The Allies at this point had overwhelming superiority in logistics. They had the necessary tanks, the artillery, the infantry support, the supply lines, the fuel, the ammunition, the food, everything. They were finally able to corner and defeat the Germans. Bernard Montgomery systematically took away options from Rommel till he was forced to make a last stand. Rommel was evacuated to Germany just before the inevitable defeat. So Rommel and the Afrika Korps lose. But to be fair, it wasn't a loss based on equality. They didn't lose because they were defeated by a superior individual opponent. They were just overwhelmed simply by man and material. It was a deluge, an avalanche. And Bernard Montgomery leads the Allies, the British and the Americans, to victory in North Africa in 43. So this is an important moment. It proved that the Germans could be beaten. On the Eastern Front, now we return to the Soviet Union. Remember, we had seen the initiation of Operation Barbarossa. That was the German invasion of Russia. We saw how much territory the Germans were able to possess and how successful they were at rolling back Soviet defenses. So on the Eastern Front, the USSR launched a counterattack in the beginning of 42. They were trying to dislodge the Germans. They were able to take back some of the ground initially, but it was a brief reversal. By spring, the Germans were ready to assume the offensive. They had remassed their forces, they had re-equipped, and they moved out. They pushed hard in multiple places. First, they launched an offensive in the south toward the oil fields of the Urals. Now, this is actually a problem. Hitler, in the early years of World War I, Hitler had always assumed very direct command of the army. And remember, when Hitler retired from the military or left the military, he was only ever, I think it was a corporal, I believe it was. He was never a general staff officer. His early victories had convinced himself that he was a better general than the generals. And by 42, he was growing increasingly erratic, and that was going to become a problem all throughout the war. And so here we are in 1942 with this German advance, and he does not have a single consolidated objective. He has a bunch of objectives. And when you have a bunch of objectives, what does that mean? That means you have to split your forces. And if you split your forces, well, you leave yourself weaker all up and down the line. Had the Germans only set out to capture the oil fields, they could have held that. But not only did they set out to capture the oil fields, they also set out to capture territory, including the city of Stalingrad. Now, Stalingrad was an important city of the Soviet Union because it was responsible of 25% of all Soviet industrial production. So tanks, guns, bullets, shells, planes, all of this, 25% of all that comes out of Stalingrad. Hitler thinks if they can take Stalingrad, that's a death blow to the Soviet economy. And he's probably not necessarily wrong, but he's trying to do everything. He's trying to do too much with too little. And so his forces are going to be spread and split. Both offensives gain massive ground. So initially, in the Urals, the Germans are able to take the oil fields, and in Stalingrad, it turns into a siege. In fact, it turns into one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Now, in an important development, Stalin had given command to General Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov was given the front. And not only was he given command, he was given both the authority and responsibility to do whatever needed to be done. Zhukov was a competent and aggressive general. He was just as good as anyone on the Allies, a very fine general, and one of the few in the Soviet Union who had not yet been executed. He was unique in many ways among his peers. And so now Zhukov is overseeing this defense against this German onslaught, particularly in the city of Stalingrad. Stalingrad becomes a grinding city of death. And the buildings in the background, many of them are blown out and shelled. Stalingrad also becomes, now this isn't an example of it. Many of these men are holding, looks like submachine guns and battle rifles. But it also became a sniper's paradise. Both sides had to be careful because both sides had hundreds and hundreds of snipers all over the city, perched in the various windows and buildings, and any false movement would result in a random and individual death. And so Stalingrad becomes this absolute grindhouse of death and destruction. By the end of 1942, the Soviets were once again on the brink. The Germans had pushed hard as they could, just like they always did. The Soviet Union did what they had always done. They threw men at the battle in hopes that they would overwhelm. Even just getting troops into the city of Stalingrad meant you had to go through intense artillery fire and shell, all these things. And many of the men died just trying to enter the city, and yet the Soviets continued. It was a deadly strategy to keep pouring men into it, but it was a useful strategy. When you don't value human life, as Stalin did not, it was at least a solution to the problem. Stalingrad was devastated. Every building, every home was just destroyed. Men lived and died within a small area. In the midst of Stalingrad, I believe there was a building called Pavlov's house, which a lieutenant had established as his base. And they had been given strict orders, don't surrender a single foot, and so they did not. And both sides dug in, and they lived and they died there. The people were brutalized, but Stalingrad held. The city and the people of Stalingrad, in the midst of just overwhelming odds, were able to survive and to hold the line. The Soviets, finally, having established Stalingrad, having held the city, went to the winter of 1942 into 1943. The German Sixth Army, this massive German force led by General Paulus, was on the brink. So the Soviets were able to surround the German Sixth Army and cut off all supply lines. Now, what should have happened right away when that happened is General Paulus requested permission from Hitler to make a breakout. So basically, if you can imagine it here, let me draw this up in the corner here. Here is the German Sixth Army. The Soviet Union is able to completely surround it. What a breakout is, and what Paulus wanted to do, was he wanted to take his forces and punch a hole through the surrounding Soviet army and restore his connection to the rest of German supplies. That is a sound and ideal strategy. That's what should have happened. But Hitler, erratic as always, screamed and demanded that Paulus not surrender one single square foot. And so the German army remains. To make things worse, Hitler had been told by Hermann Goering, once again the leader of the German Luftwaffe. You're going to notice almost every time we mention Hermann Goering, it works badly for the Germans. He is an incompetent fool of the highest order. He promises Hitler that the Air Force alone can deliver hundreds of tons of supplies per day to keep the Sixth Army going. It was a lie the moment he spoke it. So the Soviets surrounded the German Sixth Army early 1943. They could not be supplied by air. Only a tiny fraction of necessary supplies were coming in. The winter compelled the end of fighting. Goering's false guarantee that the Luftwaffe could keep the army supply led to disaster for the Germans, and sure enough, Paulus surrendered to the Soviet Union, and the entire German Sixth Army was done. Many were dead, many were taken as prisoners of war, and many had already endured so much that even though they were taken as prisoners of war, they died within a matter of weeks. And the Soviets were brutal. They did not follow what should have happened. They killed many, and they sent many others to labor camp. But this, in early 1943, represents a turning point. The Eastern Front has stabilized. The Soviet Union is going to continue. So what we've done is we have traced the developments of the African Front as it essentially closes in 1942-43, and the Allies win there. Now we've traced the Eastern Front all the way to mid-1943. The Soviets have held the Germans, they have swallowed them up, destroyed them, and now from 43 on, we're going to see the Soviets are going to have the offensive advantage. So we'll continue in the days ahead.